Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome to the virtual JCC of Metro Detroit. My name is Debbie Levin. Normally I'd be standing up at the front of the room seeing lots of familiar faces, but not tonight. I'm one of the chairs of the SAGE committee. Today's program, Sister Scholars, the Emergence of Orthodox Girls' Education in Interwar Poland, is a co-production of SAGE, Seminars for Adult Jewish Enrichment, and the Franco Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. SAGE is endowed by a generous gift from Sis Maisel and is supported by Carol and Ronald Fogel through the JCC Pillars of Light program. The Franco Center is a longtime partner of JCC, and we're thrilled to be working with them once again. And we have had programs in the worst snow. So good thing it's not this coming up week in person, because we're due for a big snow in Michigan again. If you enjoyed this event and other virtual programs, please consider donating to the cultural arts or becoming a patron of one of our festivals. You can do either or both at our website, culturalarts.jcc.org. While you're here at our YouTube channel, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel and click the reminder bell so that you'll always get up-to-date info on our exciting virtual events. More will be coming. We have really a great, exciting event for you tonight, and we want you to be part of it. So if you have questions or comments, feel free to put them in the YouTube comment box that's below, or text them to the number in the corner of your screen. Our speakers will take as many questions tonight as they can. I'm going to introduce, first of all, tonight's moderator, then he'll introduce our guest speaker. Jeff Weidlinger is the Joseph Brodsky Collegiate Professor of History and Judaic Studies and Director of the Franco Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. Professor Weidlinger is the author of several award-winning books of Eastern European Jewish life. His work has been supported by grants and fellowships from numerous agencies, including the National Endowment for Humanities and Social Science and Humanities Research Council. So please welcome Jeff to our stage tonight, virtually.
Hi, thank you, Debbie. And thanks everybody for being here. And thank you to SAGE, and thanks to the JCC. And thanks to everyone for coming out or staying in or watching this video. As Debbie mentioned, I'm the director of the Franco Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. And part of the Franco Center is we have an institute, the Franco Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies. And every year, that institute brings in about 10 to 15 leading scholars from around the globe who are working on a common theme. And they all work on the theme together usually here in Ann Arbor. This year, it's been remote for obvious reasons. But normally we have them all here in Ann Arbor, and we're privileged to have people with us working on a common theme. And this year, our theme was translating Jewish cultures, as a result of which we have several people working on translation. And this series that we've been doing with SAGE and the Detroit JCC comes out of that, comes out of this translating Jewish culture. So we'll be featuring two, over the next few weeks, two of the fellows that we have who are here for the year. So the first, and the one that we'll be talking to today, is Naomi Seidman. And Naomi Seidman is the Chancellor Jackman Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto. And she is the author of numerous works on a wide range of topics. Her first book was called Marriage Made in Heaven, Sexual Politics of Hebrew and Yiddish. She is also the author of The Marriage Plots, or How the Jews Fell in Love and with Literature, Faithful Renderings, Jewish-Christian Difference and the Politics of Translation. And she is currently here in Ann Arbor, well, not technically here, but she's currently a fellow at the Franco Institute, working on a book on Freud's Jewish languages called The Navel of the Dream, Freud's Jewish Languages. But today she's going to be talking to us about the topic of her recently published book, which came out last year, 2 years ago in 2019, called Sarah Schenirer and the Bais Yaakov Movement. And Naomi will join us in talking about exactly what the Bais Yaakov movement is, for those of you who don't know, and who Sarah Schenirer was. Certainly one of the most significant figures in Jewish history that we probably haven't heard of. Okay, or at least that many of you probably haven't heard of. So maybe I'll begin, Naomi, with that question. First of all, it's really nice to have you here and wonderful to see you. And it's been wonderful to have you as part of the Institute over the course of the year. So let me begin by asking you the simple question of who was Sarah Schenirer and what is the Bais Yaakov movement and how did you get interested in it? And I can let you talk on that for as long as you want.
That's dangerous to say that to me. But thank you so much, Jeff. It's been so wonderful to be virtually in Ann Arbor. I do mourn not being there in person. My first exposure to Ann Arbor was when I was a wild young thing. I rode cross country on a motorcycle and I rode through Ann Arbor, and I just remember all the beautiful houses with the big porches, and I thought, I want to live in this town. I think I also went to Zingerman's, so it's a little sad to be so far away. But you're in my heart, and at least I know what Ann Arbor looks like because I've had so many friends in Ann Arbor. So thanks for asking me that question. It's not clear to me whether people could see the screen. Yeah, thank you. There's the screen. Here, let me advance the slide. So how did I come to this topic? So 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, I was in Poland with a group of students from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, where I was teaching at the time. And I was in the courtyard of the cemetery of the Ramah Synagogue in Krakow. And I saw, standing pretty close to me, a group of Bais Yaakov girls. Now, how did I know they were Bais Yaakov girls? I myself was a Bais Yaakov girl, let's just say in a previous lifetime. And I can spot a Bais Yaakov girl from a mile off. And I was a little shy about approaching them. They didn't know who I was. They couldn't see that I was formerly Orthodox. But I went over to them and I said, "Are you in town for the festival?" It was the Jewish Culture Festival. And they said, "No, we're actually in town to visit the grave of the woman who founded our school system." And I said, to their evident surprise, "Oh, Sarah Schenirer? She's buried here in Krakow?" And they looked at me like, how do you know? And they told me that she is buried in Krakow and that Bais Yaakov girls come through and visit her grave. And I've since found out, since getting interested in this topic, that her grave is the site of regular pilgrimages, often at midnight. There's a little photo that somebody took of a group of Bais Yaakov girls visiting the grave of this woman at midnight. They dance and sing and post these celebrations to YouTube. So I have evidence of this. And I just found this so interesting. And I was walking back to my hotel after this, and I happened to bump into the director of the Krakow Jewish Culture Festival. And I said, "Did you know that there are these teenage girls who travel through the city on their own, visiting this grave of Sarah Schenirer?" And he said, "I had no idea. Why don't you give a talk about it next year at the festival, and maybe some of these girls will come." So I gave a talk at the festival about Bais Yaakov. I spent, a few months doing some research and got more and more interested. And after my talk, I was also just so happy to be invited to the Culture Festival, to be on the inside as opposed to the outside, to give a talk. And at the end of the talk, someone in the audience came over to me, gave me her card, and said, "I want to publish the book." And 9 years later, 8 years later, there's the book. And I'm not done. I should just say that the book was only the beginning. I now have a website. Please check it out. The reason why it keeps going is because before, when I was writing the book, I didn't have access to that much material. I only had the archives. And now that people know that I'm researching it, all kinds of people are approaching me with family archives. And I know there are people out there that also have material. And what do I do with it now that the book is out? What I do with it is www.thebaisyaakovproject.com. Please check it out. Okay, so what was Bais Yaakov and who was Sarah Schenirer? Sorry, just trying to click here. Oh, there it is. So, there actually, we're just publishing a blog on our website called The Many Faces of Sarah Schenirer, and there are many more faces than this. If I had, there are many images of Sarah Schenirer floating around. And the reason why there are many images of Sarah Schenirer floating around is that for a very long time, she didn't allow her photograph to be published. And the myth is she didn't allow her photograph to be published because she was so modest. Doing research, I discovered that she considered herself really ugly and didn't want her photograph to be published. And when I was writing the book, I was trying to think, well, we discovered a photograph about 10 years ago in the archives. We got a photograph that's part of an ID card application. And I thought, do I publish it? She didn't want her photo to be published. And I thought I would, but very small. That's why, that's my compromise. That's why the photo's so small. But it's all over the internet. So if you really want to see it, you can. She considered herself unattractive. All of that is totally now an Orthodox discourse. Now the story is, oh, she's too modest. And in many places in the Orthodox world, they don't publish women's photos. And somehow she's supposed to be the first one who figured out that a woman's photo isn't supposed to be published. This is one of the ways in which Sarah Schenirir's memory is mobilized for certain conservative aims. So who was Sarah Schenirer? She was a divorced seamstress with an 8th grade education. Seamstress is putting it a little imprecisely. She was a high-end dressmaker, actually, who in 1917 founded a girls' school in her dressmaker studio in order to deal with what was a widely acknowledged problem, which was the mass defection of Orthodox girls from their traditional homes, running away to join the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, the Zionist Party, just to convert to Christianity, to marry their Gentile boyfriends, even to become prostitutes. This was a huge problem in the Orthodox world that they were unable to deal with for various political reasons that I'm willing to explain if someone's curious. And Sarah Schenirer just dealt with it. She started a school, and the school grew with astonishing speed. And this here is the first, by 1923, there were 7 schools. In 1923, she was still running these schools pretty much on her own with a small group of Krakow Orthodox men who were helping her with the financial stuff. But she herself was founding the schools and running them using this kind of apprenticeship system where she would take her dressmaker apprentice. Well, this is how it usually worked. People would hear that there was a school in Krakow for girls that was appealing to people, it was attractive to girls, and they would write her desperate letters saying, we just had, the Rebbe's granddaughter just ran away to go to university. Please come start a school, help us save our girls. And she would show up in the town and she would speak in a public space to an open assembly. And she would give a fiery speech. How long can you sit idly by while your daughters sit at the Shabbos table reading their novels, their hearts cold to you? Let them study with me. Let me come and start a school here. And you will see their hearts grow warm to Judaism, to Torah, to Shabbos. And she would have with her one of her older girls that were living in this kind of two-room schoolhouse that she had in a tenement apartment in Krakow, that she would have dressed up to look older. So a 13, 14, 15-year-old girl, and she'd say, if one of you has a, who doesn't have teenage boys in the house, and you're willing to put up this girl and start, she will take care of it. She'll start the school, she'll collect tuition, and then this girl would be the teacher in town. My mother was one of these teachers, and she will save your schools. And then the girl herself would stand up and say, I also was losing interest in Judaism. I wasn't listening to my parents. And then I met Sarah Schenirer, and suddenly Judaism became a powerful force for me. And now, if you could understand what it's like for us to sit around the Shabbos table, and next thing you know, there would be a school in that town. And then next thing you know, you have the chart in front of you, 265 schools in 1933. If for those of you who are adept at reading charts closely, you will notice that between the years 1925 and 1926, suddenly there aren't that many schools opening. And why is that? Because that's the year that the World Aguda, the Agudas Yisrael, the organization of World Orthodox Jews, took over Sarah Schenire's school system. And the first thing they did is to shut down the rapid expansion. They said, this is crazy. This isn't how schools open. There's no textbooks. There's nothing, there's no permission. All these schools are illegal. First thing they did is shut down at least stop expanding, to try to put this kind of wild school system on more professional grounds. So what was Bais Yaakov? Maybe I'll just do a couple of more slides. And then I'll stop and take a couple of questions if people have questions. Bais Yaakov was, and here's a picture of what it looked like throughout Poland. By the time these two maps were put together by the group of men on the top right of your screen, they were the German Jewish administrators of the school. The school was, the Aguda was a kind of coalition of Eastern European Hasidic, ultra-Orthodox Jews and German Jewish, more modern, more professional schools. And basically the Eastern Europeans outsourced the problem of girls' education to the German Jews. They didn't feel like they understood how to talk to girls or how to run a modern school system. So they let the German Jewish men do it. People with PhDs and some experience in education. They'd professionalized Orthodox education for girls and boys in Germany, many decades before. And they brought these men into Poland to run the system. And this is a map that was put together by this delegation of German-speaking Orthodox Jews in 1931. You can see all the schools throughout Poland. By this point, the Bais Yaakov school system had also expanded to Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania. It would expand even further over the coming decade to the United States, to Palestine, to Western Europe. And I'll just do another slide or two, if that's okay. So what was Bais Yaakov? Bais Yaakov was many different things. It was more like a very complicated system. Most of the schools, I'd say probably 80–90%, were one-room schools in small towns that were after-school programs for girls who were otherwise going to Bais Yaakov, to public schools. They were, as I said, one-room schools, so they could often teach many, many students. Sometimes these small towns developed, larger schools. There you see on the top right, Bais Yaakov of Slonim, that's Kita Vav, so they already had separate grades. When my mother had a Bais Yaakov in Torda during the war, she had 90 students that were between the ages of 3 and 20, and she herself was only 18. So when it started. So these were all kinds of different schools, many of them fly by the seat of your pants operations. In larger towns, they were all-day schools where secular subjects were taught. They were legal. Sometimes they had their own building. On the bottom left, you have the Bais Yaakov of Panovich, which is a yeshiva town in Lithuania. This is a fundraising postcard. And Panovich actually lobbied to have a high school in their town, specifically because they were looking for potential brides for their yeshiva students. Before Bais Yaakov was founded, the Ger Rebbe complained he had 2,000 bachelor followers who had no shot at getting married because there were no girls that were interested in marrying a chassid. So one of the jobs of Bais Yaakov was to make Hasidic men a little more appealing. And there in the bottom right, what you have is a dressmaking workshop, which was dressmaking was part of, and vocational training of other varieties, was part of Bais Yaakov from the very start. Sarah Scheniner's first teachers and students were studying not only Torah with her, but also dressmaking, lace making, curtain making. This kind of dressmaking was an attractive field for Orthodox women because it kept them away from the factories where Sabbath desecration and sexual abuse were rampant. So if a woman could open up a dressmaking studio, she could avoid going into that kind of atmosphere. Eventually, by the 1930s, you get large vocational training institutes, both at the high school and the post-high school level, where, you know, hundreds of girls who could get a degree not only in dressmaking, but also in nursing or bookkeeping, social work, etc. These were called Ohel Sarah, named after Sarah Schenirer after her death. Let's see. So another sort of interesting aspect, I think, about Bais Yaakov, and I'll just do this slide and then I'll stop for questions, is that Bais Yaakov from the very start had a love of theater. So Sarah Schenirer herself was theater mad, like many other people in interwar Poland. She went to the theater a lot, but she also wrote plays, and Bais Yaakov was famous for its amateur theater. And the reason, and as you can see, some of these photos are, you know, the one on the top right, there's a lot of girls wearing beards. I'm sure that was part of the attraction of theater. There's a lot of cross-dressing. I have lots of stories about Bais Yaakov theater, if anyone is curious. The picture on the left is of importance to me for two reasons. One is that it's the Bais Yaakov of Buchach. Buchach was my father's hometown, and my aunt, my father's sister, was the Bais Yaakov teacher in Buchach. I never met my aunt. She was killed in the Holocaust. It's possible that the teacher on the left is my aunt, but I'm not 100% sure about that. And the other reason that this picture is so precious to me, other than just how beautiful it is, it's one of the most beautiful photos I have, is that if you look at it, you see that it's probably a photo, the play is probably Joseph and his brothers, which was a kind of beloved, those are the 12 stars or whatever. It was beloved in Bais Yaakov, just like it was in the Purim-Spiel. And the Purim-Spiel was sort of beloved because it had so many male parts, might have been beloved for the same reason in Bais Yaakov. The other reason that's of interest to me is that Bais Yaakov, the main time that they put on their biggest play that they rehearsed for months was Shabbos Hanukkah. And that time of year in interwar Poland is a very important time for Polish passion plays and Christmas pageants. And if you look at the photo on the top left, is not a Bais Yaakov play, it's a Christmas pageant from the 1930s, just like the Bais Yaakov play. And you can see that a lot of the costumes look remarkably similar to the ones in the Bais Yaakov play. And it's at least possible that some of these Bais Yaakov girls are wearing their Bais Yaakov pageant costumes, you know, in their public schools in the morning and then in the afternoon and the evening for their Bais Yaakov plays. So I'm going to stop sharing and take some questions if people are interested, and I'll share again. Are there any questions?
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, and thanks so much for sharing that with us. There's a one question that's come up, but let me first ask a more general question, which is, you know, kind of alludes to, you know, what I said at the beginning, which is that she's such an influential person, Sarah Schenirer, and yet people, you know, haven't really written about her until now. And why do you think it has taken so long? I mean, there have been a few books within the, you know, within certain a few smaller books. But why do you think that it's taken so long to bring attention to her as a major figure in Jewish history?
Very, very shocking to me. She's so important. She's been described as the most important figure in 20th century Orthodoxy. And you'll notice I didn't say the most important woman in 20th century Orthodoxy. She basically rescued Orthodoxy, there's no doubt. So why hasn't she been written about? First of all, there are very few people who write about Orthodoxy. And there's one book about the Aguda. There's basically Gershom Bakon's The Politics of Tradition. There's, when you go to J Press to look for newspapers, for some reason they left the Orthodox newspapers to the end. The idea is that Orthodoxy has its own history. But there are Orthodox books about her, but they're hagiography. They're not, they're very pious. The way I was taught about Sarah Schenirer, I mean, they don't even talk about the fact that she was divorced. They say unfortunately, she never had any children, as if like Sarah Imenu, like the matriarch Sarah, she never had children. So there's a huge amount of censorship and self-censorship within the Orthodox world. And then within the non-Orthodox world, I'm really curious. I think there's actually a kind of prejudice that it's just not interesting because it's Orthodoxy. It's going to be pious. And yes, it's pious. And I have to say that the piety gets to me too. And it's a little, annoying and worse. But it's also fascinating, the idea that Orthodox women that you think, or Orthodox girls, what could be more, protected, insular? And yet Bais Yaakov was really a way that it got them out of the house. It got them to travel. When I saw those girls traveling on their own, they were 18, 19. There's not that many girls out there traveling around Eastern Europe by themselves. And yet this is totally accepted. And I did it when I was 17. And the way it works, so in other words, you're given freedom. So it works through networks of connection. When I was going from my seminary year in Jerusalem back to New York to Brooklyn, my friends and family, whatever, gave me places to stay. I joked afterwards that I stayed in Borough Park first I was in Borough Park in Zurich, then I was in Borough Park in Paris, and then I was in Borough Park in London. So everywhere I went, I was in the same place, but at least I was in a different country. So those same networks were the networks that kept girls, that gave girls the power, the mobility to travel around Eastern Europe on their own. And there were so many stories of travel. So I really think it's the phenomenon is of interest beyond, in other words, if it was just about a bunch of rabbis going, okay, you girls, you're going to go sit and learn Torah now, as opposed to this wild story about this divorced seamstress and, the international white slave trade, I wouldn't have written a book about it. It's too juicy, So I think it's much juicier than people know. But I'll just say one other thing, which is that I proposed this to the Jewish Lives series, which doesn't have that many women. It has hardly any Orthodox Jews. I said, you should do one about Sarah Schenirer. And they said, thanks, but no thanks.
Interesting. Yeah, because she would be perfect for a series like that.
I thought so. I'm still in shock. And I also proposed my book. When I proposed my book to Princeton University Press, not interested. People are not interested in Orthodox Jews. I understand it's not sexy. What could be less sexy than, this woman, Sarah Schenirer, overweight, divorced, out of her mind, religious maniac, really religious genius. Should I keep going? Because there's
other questions, but I'm certainly enjoying hearing you talk. But maybe I'll throw in one of the other questions, which is maybe if you could talk a little bit about what the girls were taught at the school, other than a trade, is how the question is phrased. But what were
they taught? Yeah. It's interesting because what were they taught? Question. When I started researching this, one of the first things I did, it's hard to research in the Orthodox world if you're not yourself Orthodox. One of the things I did is I went through the Shoah archives, and you can actually search them. And every time anyone mentioned Bais Yaakov, you could find that spot and you can hear. And every single time they were asked, what were you taught? And there would be this kind of dead silence. And they would go, oh, we were taught little Ivra. We were taught to daven. You hear that a lot. We were taught Torah. The question what they were taught elicited nothing. In other words, what they were taught was actually, given that this is a school, that's when I realized it was about the plays and it was about the hiking. It wasn't just what they were taught, it was how they were taught. So for instance, Sarah Schenirer, along with being theater crazy, loved to hike. In her diary is full of, I just went for a 14-hour hike. This is like, I just hiked for, her idea of God was about being on the top of a mountain. And this is what she inculcated. And also travel. She loved to travel and she loved to, what she was jealous of was that Hasidim got to travel and only the men got to travel and the women didn't. And she basically brought Hasidism into girls' lives through travel. So travel was a huge part of this and hiking was a big part of it. So what do I mean by she taught them how to daven? This is how she taught them how to daven. She took them on many stories like this. A nighttime hike. She loved the idea of a nighttime hike. There are all these like memoirs about how she's on the bottom of the mountain and they start at midnight and it's so dark. There's only a little bit of moonlight and they're all holding hands as they go up the mountain. We're talking about, tons of libidinous energy. This is, 14-year-old girls that would otherwise be socialists. And they hike up the mountain and in the middle of the night, they light a fire and Sarah Schenirer tells them some Torah. And nobody remembers the Torah she taught. What they remember is the whatever the Torah was. It ends with, and so girls, Hashem is here and Torah is important and we will revive the spirit of Judaism. And then they dance around her in a state of ecstasy. It's basically a rave. And then they hike to the top of the mountain just as the sun comes up. And then they daven shacharis. They daven the morning prayers. So this is what they learned how to do. And it was instilled through nature worship, through travel, and through the erotics of take these girls away from their families because their families aren't working and put them into the woods together. That's what it was. It was a kind of outward bound program. There's much of that as you could possibly bring into the education. What they learned was, what they learned. Torah, besides that, actually in the seminary is a little bit more sophisticated. My mother went to Chernovitz, which was the third seminary in Bukovina. And there it was all taught by German, young women with PhDs or in the PhD program in education. And they learned, radical pedagogical methods. My mother learned Freud and psychoanalysis. She told me one thing she remembered is in her pedagogy class, they were like, how do you teach Psalms? Which is interesting because now my mother says Tehillim for 2 hours a day at least. And they had to write a reading of a psalm that was from the perspective of a non-human actor, agent within the psalms. And my mother wrote one about being, a blade of grass. And they did interpretive dance. I mean, this is interwar Poland. They're influenced by Korczak. They knew about the pedagogies of Korczak. So they learned what I would call
explain who Korczak is. Do you want to just explain who Janusz Korczak is?
Janusz Korczak was a radical pedagogue in interwar Poland who believed that children should govern themselves, write their own newspapers, and the children in his school had their own radio station. In Bais Yaakov too, in the youth groups, adults were not allowed to speak. Except Sarah Schenirer when she came to visit. Otherwise, they had communal. They shared school supplies. There was a collective. Many of them lived collectively after they graduated. So there's a real socialist spirit and also a radically democratic spirit. And Sarah Schenirer had that radicality. The rabbis that took over the organization in 1925 were not that radical. That's why they took it away from her. But she herself was influenced by all kinds of radical ideas.
Okay, so we've got some other questions that are brewing, and I just want to respond to something that you said that I found really interesting, which is that when you ask people what they remember about what they learned, that they talk about the hiking and the camaraderie. I did a little bit of work myself on Soviet Yiddish schools in the 1930s, and we interviewed people about their experiences in those schools, and we encountered the exact same thing. Nobody remembers a thing that they learned, but they remember the sense of camaraderie. They remember the hiking in particular, which I guess hiking, scouting was a big part of education in the 20s and 30s and progressive education. I wish it were again, because I think kids could benefit a lot from going on more hikes and getting outside. But I think it's really interesting that that there's that commonality. I wonder if maybe all schools, if you ask anybody what they remember about their schooling, they remember the camaraderie and the hiking rather than education.
Right.
However, we do have other questions about the curriculum. Particularly, people are asking about the Jewish, well, they're asking about the Jewish studies curriculum, but maybe about the Judaism curriculum, what they're learning about Judaism, how they're learning to be Jewish in the schools.
So first of all, the idea that there is something called Judaism in the yeshiva. So one of the things you have to understand about Bais Yaakov is that Bais Yaakov was basically a modern Orthodox phenomenon, right? So there's no tradition for educating girls except in the home. Maybe you bring in a tutor to teach them how to read and write, how to daven, but there's no real curriculum. So where does the curriculum come from? And these rebbes, they don't know what to do. It says in the Talmud, you're not supposed to teach a girl Torah. What does that mean? They finally decided it means you don't teach them Talmud. So what do you teach them and how do you teach them? And basically what they did is they borrowed the curriculum from the Hirsch schools, the Hirsch Realschule in Germany. And what that meant is that for the first time, instead of what does the yeshiva look like? It looks like you stand next to your chavrusa and you learn Talmud all day. The girls are not allowed to do that. You're not even supposed to see a Talmud. So the curriculum is, so suddenly you're learning something called chumash, which boys don't learn. You have this concept of Judaism. Also, boys never heard of that. What's Judaism? And you borrow the textbooks from Germany, and you have a class which isn't all day long, the way the yeshiva is, with little breaks for the Rebbe to give a lecture. There are classes, there are report cards. I have here a report card. I collect Bais Yaakov material. This is a Pinkas Talmidah. This is from Palestine in the 40s, I think, or the late 30s. The idea of a report card is unknown in the yeshiva. The idea of physical education is unknown in the yeshiva. So basically what you have is what looks like more or less a modern school, where the girl is going to a modern school learning things like literature and that there's something called Judaism with textbooks, and her brother, maybe her twin brother, has an entirely different kind of education. So you have what used to be denominational distinction between German Jewry and Eastern European Judaism that now becomes a gender distinction in Eastern Europe. That stuff is okay. That modern stuff is okay for the girls, but that still persists, which means that now in ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods, the girls have a serious, real education and the boys do not. My brother has a GED. I have a PhD, sorry for boasting, and it's not a coincidence.
So do you agree with that argument that girls were given access to greater secular knowledge as a result of which they could be at the forefront of modernity and progressiveness within Judaism? That some scholars have made, you included, I guess. Obviously, you agree.
Yes, yes, it's true for the secularizers. So Iris Karush talks about that as an engine of secularization. It's also true for Orthodoxy that educated women keep the bread coming onto the table and make it possible for the men to sit and learn for 100 years. There's a division of labor. The distinction is that before, in the interwar period, the men supported the girls learning for its own sake. And now the girls, when they learn, it's all directed toward, marrying a man who sits and learns and raising 15 kids, etc. So that's changed.
So there's another question asking about the differences between the movement in various other countries, how it spread to the United States and other countries, and also if you could talk a little bit about how the movement survived the war and managed to get through the war. But I'm also specifically curious about the different ways in which girls were educated in different countries and different contexts. I mean, Krakow in 1917 is very different than than Detroit today. So yeah.
Yeah. So Detroit, by the way, is I think the third Bais Yaakov in the United States. The first one was in Williamsburg and was founded in 1937, 1938. The second was in Baltimore, it was 1941, and Detroit was 1943. I mean, it was in the city, not in Oak Park. So how are they? First of all, there's a real distinction between these after school, most of them illegal schools that you have in Poland, and Bais Yaakovs are now full day schools. They're not after school programs. And when they were after school programs, they were basically missionary schools. I mean, what Orthodox people call kiruv. They were trying to attract families of all types. Now Bais Yaakov, at least in the United States, and especially in the urban centers, is doing the opposite. If you have a TV in your house, you get kicked out of the Bais Yaakov. It's a retrenchment kind of model to keep the borders very, very clear between us and the rest of the world. And when you go to in places like Detroit, where there's one Bais Yaakov, it's way more tolerant. The Bais Yaakov in Detroit actually shares a campus with the boys' school. That's unthinkable in New York, anywhere in New York. In New York, the Bais Yaakovs are organized according to, whatever that narcissism of minor differences. Every Bais Yaakov takes a tiny slice of the demographic. Like we're the people who oops, sorry about that. We're the people who, only wear thick tights and would never, it's all about degrees of difference. And then when you get it, and then it also has to do with, in Warsaw had a few Bais Yaakovs, but they were organized according to neighborhoods. They weren't differentiated by Hasidic group. Now they're all differentiated by Hasidic group. In Israel, they're differentiated by Mizrahi versus Ashkenazi. So to me, it's very sad because somebody said something to me that made such an impression, which is that Bais Yaakov is the one thing that Orthodoxy has that unites it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that there are no factions of the community that are outside Bais Yaakov. There are some people who consider Bais Yaakov to be not kosher at all. They call it Bais Esav. But it's the biggest thing that Orthodoxy has that unites it. I was in a Bais Yaakov class with the daughter of the Baba Rebbe, and that's no longer the case. The daughter of the Baba Rebbe would not go to Bais Yaakov Borough Park. She'd go to Bais Yaakov, the Baba variety of Bais Yaakov. So it's all fragmented and balkanized now. That's one of the ways in which it's changed. But it's only like that in the urban centers. When you look at Bais Yaakovs outside New York or Lakewood, places like Detroit, you see a lot of that pioneering energy, but there are very few dormitories. Bais Yaakov was a dormitory school, and dormitory was a huge part of the experience. And it was what made it such a total institution and such a youth institution. And it's now much more closely connected to the family, which makes it more conservative, I think.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that's part of the transition from geographic relocation?
How it survived, why it had this different form in the United States and in Israel, and I mean it's geographic, but it's also the times. I mean, Bais Yaakov was basically working within an ideological field of possibilities, of options that included socialism, Zionism, youth movements. It had to compete with these, and it was also, honestly influenced by this. I mean, there were Bais Yaakov teachers that were also communists, or at least socialists, and maybe also communists. I'm still trying to figure that out. So there was just a lot more of that in the Jewish world than there is now. But there are some. I'm actually in touch with the Bais Yaakov school student at the in Detroit, who's wants to bring a kind of anti-racism agenda to the school, which is amazing. And that's the kind of thing that you don't see that much of, a kind of the blurring of the boundaries between the Orthodox world and the secular world around it.
Yeah. There's a great question here of why it's called Bais Yaakov. Why didn't they pick a matriarch to name it after?
Great question. And Bais Yaakovs, by the way, they're not all called Bais Yaakov. They're sometimes called, they're often called after Sarah Schenirer, but the general overall term, which was given to it, one of Sarah Scheniner's early helpers among those Krakow men who helped her run the business end of Bais Yaakov, where the name comes from is, it's a midrash on a verse in Exodus that's right at the beginning of the giving of the Torah on Sinai. It says, Ko tomar levet Yaakov v'tagid livnei Yisrael. So shall you say to the house of Jacob, Bais Yaakov is the house of Jacob, and say to the children of Israel. And they seem like very parallel constructions, which is fine with the Torah, but the rabbis say that the Torah never repeats itself, so there must be a difference. And what's the difference? Beit Yaakov, Rashi says, Elu Hanashim. So the house of Jacob, house, is the women. Bais Yaakov not only took this as warrant that the Torah was given to women first, to girls and women first, because first it says Beit Yaakov, then it says Bnei Israel, but it turned so this was 3 days before when the Torah was given. Traditionally, that's understood to be Shavuot. And on Gimel Sivan, which is 3 days before Shavuos, Bais Yaakov had Sarah Schenirer invented a Jewish holiday out of whole cloth, because we all know there aren't enough Jewish holidays. And this was a holiday in which it was yet another opportunity for what I'm describing as the rave experience, which is dancing around Sarah Schenirer, bonfires, singing these Bais Yaakov songs, Ko tomar levet Yaakov, till everybody's high. That's basically, the educational curriculum in Bais Yaakov.
Mm-hmm. Maybe if you can talk a little bit about what the reception of the book has been since it came out, both among those who grew up in Bais Yaakov and just those who didn't really know much about it before. And I know that you have the website that you mentioned, and maybe the way people have contributed to that, if you can talk about that a little bit.
So it's always very interesting to me. Like, I have no idea I just assumed that this was a book. In some ways, I didn't care whether Princeton was going to publish it, because who's going to read this book? There's who's interested in orthodoxy that isn't themselves either Orthodox or ex-Orthodox? So I didn't even worry about that. I basically just thought about, I didn't want to offend the Orthodox community too much, because I figured they were my only customers. And I spent a lot of time, do I say that I'm not Orthodox anymore or not? And how do I pitch that exactly? And my editor was actually sort of careful, don't say this. You don't have to say this. It's but in terms of just saying who I was, I'm a terrible faker. I'm a bad liar. Not that I'm so good and virtuous. It's just that I don't do it well. So I ended up just telling everybody on the first page, in the first paragraph of the book, I'm no longer Orthodox. I just couldn't keep a secret. So to me, what that means is that the book isn't going to be carried in Orthodox bookstores, many Orthodox bookstores. It just won't be. They don't carry outsiders. And it means that if the Orthodox world finds out about it, they have to do it, through Amazon or, through word of mouth. So I've actually been sort of pleasantly surprised that the book is read. I mean, my mother really didn't want me to read it, because she's like, whatever I write, it doesn't mean anything to her. Nobody in her world reads it. It makes no difference. This is something that her people were going to find out about, and she was very nervous about it. And just a few months ago, she said to me, the Rebbitzin read your book. and liked it. So she's like very grudgingly, I managed to do it. I managed to like maintain, my connection with that community. And I'm moved. It isn't just me that I managed to do it, that there's more openness than I predicted. And actually somebody just emailed me and said that, that the YU library, somebody stole a copy of my book, and now, and it was everybody, there was like a long waiting list for it. So Yeshiva University, there's real, so it's brought me in contact with the Orthodox world again, and it's introduced me to a whole phenomenon which I didn't know about, and they found out about my book even before it was out. And this is the amateur historians, most of them men, who spend all their time doing the history that the Orthodox world doesn't otherwise manage, that comb the online archives. I have somebody who sends me things like twice a day. I mean, it would be a full-time job just answering this one guy. And he's a Hasidic guy in Borough Park, and he just doesn't know who else to share this stuff with. And he loves history. And that's part of what my website is, to give people like that a forum to do history seriously. You don't need, well, I mean, I shouldn't say this to you, Jeff, but there are people who are real archive rats without any kind of professional training. None of these people have professional training, not that I do, but and what I'm trying to do is say, here's a place for it. Let's just all do this collectively. It's a crowdsourced project.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful way of doing what we call public history. We talk about public history a lot, and so many people think public history means those of us in the academy speaking to the public, and that's part of it. But it also means the public speaking to us, and it means them giving us their voices and allowing us to tell their stories in a different way. And I think you're doing a great job of that with the website, as well as with the book.
Oh, thank you. If there's anyone out there who has Bais Yaakov stories and wants to be interviewed by me, I'm working on Bais Yaakov today. I'm working on, or after the Holocaust, and I'm really interested in hearing people's stories.
So another viewer asked, I think we may have answered this question in part, but are you surprised that the secular publishers weren't interested? Did you approach religious publishers? And he or she notes also there seems to be a bias against traditional life, which I think you've talked about a little bit. But yeah, you say that there's been a large level of interest among those who continue to remain within Orthodoxy. Has that surprised you? Maybe if you can talk a little bit, you did a little bit already, but maybe you can expand upon that for that question.
I think people understand that they're being fed bubble mices and fake news, as we call it. Yeah. And the thing that's so odd is that why do you have, what is it about Sarah Schenirer that you have to cover up? That God forbid she was divorced? I mean, she was a religious genius. She was entirely religious. I'm not saying she wasn't religious. She was religious in an eccentric fashion. Some of that eccentricity, some of that charisma is something that the Orthodox world desperately needs. And that's the thing about charisma. You never know where it'll show up. It's, she wasn't a college graduate. She didn't have, and I think people know this in the Orthodox world. I mean, it's true that the Orthodox world has gone, very seriously to the right, religiously, politically. And I don't blame people for having some kind of aversion to that. I mean, I just checked out my old zip code. It went 98% for Trump. And the block I live on right now, it's probably the other way around. So, I mean, but within that community, even though it looks like a voting block, it looks like a sea of black. There's so much individual creativity and energy that's just thirsting to express itself. And it's not just that history provides people with a platform, but that this period, the period of this interwar period in which all these Orthodox experiments were taking place, in which there were Orthodox, collective agricultural colonies, there were Orthodox poets, that Orthodox life seemed so open and had some of that revolutionary energy that we associate with communism or the socialism, that they participated in those revolutionary currents. I think there's some kind of feeling that something like that has to happen again in the Orthodox world. Something to give people more of their own voice, their own creativity back.
Mm-hmm. And maybe, we only have a couple minutes left, but maybe I'll close it by asking you about that, about the future and what you see as the future for the Bais Yaakov movement. If you think the Orthodox world has the type of dynamism that it had in the 20s and 30s, to me, it does seem actually very dynamic in a different way. There's different priorities, but certainly there's a vibrancy in the Orthodox movement that, as somebody who's secular myself, I kind of envy a little bit, actually. The dynamism that they've got. So maybe you can just give us your thoughts on the future.
So I think that there's certain areas that are that open up to that dynamism more than other areas. What I mean is that the conformism, the kind of narrow path of you get to have a wild time and then you're married and it's all over, and you support your husband's Torah study, that there's certain exceptions to first of all, there's that wild time before you get married. People talk about the Amish as having that wild year, but Bais Yaakov provided it too. But I actually think that the pilgrimage tradition, which I witnessed, that got me interested in I got interested in it because pilgrimage, which Sarah Schenirer brought to girls. It was a Hasidic tradition. You visit the graves of Hasidic rabbis, or you visit your own family's, shtetls where they come from. Those are well-known phenomena. The fact that there are women and girls who are traveling on their own throughout Eastern Europe to pay tribute at the grave of a woman who died in 1935, and this phenomenon is only getting off the ground. It's only going to get more and more. That this is a kind of itself, whether consciously or not, is a source of a kind of female power and religious creativity, just from whatever energy comes out of that particular gravesite. For what, a certain kind of religious genius combined with a pioneering spirit, an openness to nature, and an openness to new experience. I think that's where it's located. I think the nerve center of where Bais Yaakov is going is in Krakow, Poland.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you one other question that came in on the questions. I know I said that was the last, but that was not really true.
Yeah, I was trying to tie it up with the bow. Did you get it?
I know, and it was so nicely tied up. And yeah, I'm going to ask.
Now
We'd actually, apparently
some
some people had the wrong link and came in late. So for those who came in late, I'm giving them the opportunity, and this is one of them. This question's from Elliot Ginsberg, who's a colleague and friend of mine at University of Michigan.
Hi, Elliot. I know him too.
Of course, right. Yeah. And he asks if Sarah Schenirer interacted with folks like Hillel Zeitlin and Fischl Schneerson, who bridged worlds and were drawn to nature, mysticism, and Freud, respectively. Was she part of a conversation that not only bridged German and Eastern European worlds, but also genders? And it's a good question. So we'll end on that.
I love that question. And I'll tell you, I don't have a slide of this, but I actually just got a research grant from the Canadian Research Council. And we're generating new research projects around Bais Yaakov. And one of the research projects we're doing is a network project, which is to figure out through various publications who's connected with who, including what are the connections between Sarah Schenirer and Hillel Zeitlin. And even now, if we had time, I could go and find a chart and tell you how connected they were. And we're only the beginning. We're only in the first couple of weeks of figuring this out. But it's my theory, it's my hypothesis right now that the Aguda had a left wing. What is that? How could, ultra-Orthodoxy have a left wing? I think it still has a left wing, but it really had a left wing in the 1920s and the 1930s. And my father was in it. He's right in that network map. So is Hillel Zeitlin. So is Schneerson. So is, in other words, so is Eliezer Schindler. Who is a leader of the organization called Olim, which is this collective agriculturalist movement that I'm talking about. So all the poets and the crazies and the Freudians, they all love first, and the socialists, they all loved Bais Yaakov. Why they loved Bais Yaakov? Because Bais Yaakov was the avant-garde of the Aguda. Everything at Bais Yaakov was new. Supposedly the Aguda is about tradition, and yet they have this crazy experimental girls' school. So all of those people wanted to know Sarah Schenirer. They all came through her seminary. They all visited the summer colonies. They wanted to give lectures. She was the most interesting thing around, other than they themselves. So there's no doubt that she, that's where she felt most comfortable. Her closest tie was with Eliezer Gershon Friedenson, who was a publisher, who was also one of the founders of Poale Agudas Yisrael, the socialist Aguda organization. So that's where those people hung out. And the rest of the rabbis pretended they didn't exist.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being with us, Naomi, and thank you everybody for coming on. And apologies to those of you who got the wrong link initially, but glad you were able to come find us and join us. And I'll turn things over to Debbie. You're muted, Debbie. Debbie, you're muted. Debbie? Yeah. Oh, good.
So while Debbie is...
Got it? Okay, here I am. Sorry. Didn't want to have background sounds. So thanks to all of you visiting us from your home. It was really an interesting talk, especially because I know my Zaidi was Orthodox, so I was familiar with this community growing up and have friends whose children go to Bais Yaakov here. So it was really interesting, Naomi. I want to thank all of you for attending tonight and encourage you to go. And also, I want you to consider coming back again on February the 17th, also at 7 p.m. We'll have another Franco Institute fellow. And she'll be talking about Releasing Roots, Hebrew Poetry in Translation, Adriana X. Jacobs. So mark that on your calendars. It should be another really interesting talk. We'll learn some new things. And consider donating also to the cultural arts. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.